At first, the men in the longships thought the city would burn like the others. They had seen smoke rise from monasteries before. They had seen wooden halls collapse beneath flame. They had watched villages empty at the sound of oars striking black water, because in the world they knew, speed was power, fear was a weapon, and fire was often enough. But this time, the shore did not break. No frightened monks ran into the fields. No timber gate stood waiting to be split. No village roofs bent beneath the first sparks. Ahead of them, rising through the morning mist, stood walls. Stone walls. High, cold, and silent. The Vikings had come from a world of ships, axes, rivers, and flame. They had mastered the sudden attack. They had turned the coastline of Europe into a place where people listened for the sea. But now they had reached something different. A kind of enemy that did not bleed. A kind of enemy that did not panic. A kind of enemy that could not be burned. And in that moment, the old Viking way of war began to change. Not because the Northmen had lost their courage. Not because their weapons had failed. But because the world in front of them had become harder, thicker, and more patient than anything they had expected. A wall does not run. A wall does not scream. A wall simply waits. And for men who had built their legend on movement, terror, and speed, that waiting was the beginning of a new kind of war. The first great Viking attacks were not designed for long sieges. They were built for shock. A longship could cross open water, slide into shallow rivers, and appear where no army was supposed to appear. It did not need a deep harbor. It did not need a road. It did not need permission from kings or priests or watchmen. It could arrive with the tide. And by the time the warning bells began, it was often too late. The strength of the Viking raid was not just violence. Violence existed everywhere in the early medieval world. The strength was timing. Surprise. Mobility. The ability to strike a place that believed itself distant from war. A monastery on an island. A market town beside a river. A royal estate with wealth but little defense. These were not battles in the grand old sense. They were sudden ruptures in ordinary life. Men with round shields and iron blades stepping out of the fog. Doors broken open. Silver taken. Hostages dragged away. Flames rising behind them as the ships turned back toward the water. For years, this pattern worked with terrifying success. The Vikings did not need to control territory to become powerful. They needed to make every coast feel exposed. They needed kings to spend treasure on tribute, soldiers on patrols, and sleepless nights wondering where the next sail would appear. Their ships were engines of anxiety. Their reputation moved faster than their bodies. And when fear travels ahead of an army, the army arrives already half victorious. But every weapon teaches its enemies. Every raid leaves survivors. Every burned settlement leaves behind a lesson. Slowly, across the lands the Vikings attacked, people began to understand that courage alone was not enough. A village could not simply hope the raiders would choose another shore. A monastery could not pray itself into safety. A king could not chase every ship across every river. The answer had to be stronger than panic. It had to be made of earth, timber, and stone. In Anglo-Saxon England, fortified burhs began to rise and strengthen. In Frankish lands, bridges were defended, river crossings guarded, and walls repaired. In Ireland, coastal settlements adapted. Across Europe, the easy targets became fewer, and the places of wealth began to hide behind barriers that did not care how fierce the men outside looked. The Vikings had changed the world. Then the world changed around them. At first, a wall may have seemed like just another obstacle. A gate could be attacked. A roof could be burned. A defender could be killed. But a true fortified town was not a wooden church, and it was not an isolated farm. It was a system. The ditch slowed the attackers. The rampart raised the defenders. The wall denied the charge. The tower gave sight and reach. The gate forced the enemy into a narrow place where courage became crowded, and death had very little room to miss. A man with an axe is dangerous. 100 men with axes are terrifying. But against a high wall, their strength must find a way upward. And that is where the simple violence of the raid began to meet the colder mathematics of siege warfare. To attack a wall, an army needed time. Time to gather tools. Time to bring ladders. Time to cut timber. Time to test the defenses. Time to starve the people inside, if storming the walls failed. And time was the one thing the Viking raiding system had never liked to spend. Time meant defenders could prepare. Time meant enemy armies could march. Time meant supplies ran low. Time meant disease, boredom, quarrels, and the slow erosion of fear. A raid burns hot. A siege burns slowly. And not every warrior raised on the glory of sudden violence was prepared for the discipline of waiting outside stone. Still, the Vikings were not fools. Their success had never come from stupidity or blind savagery. That was the story their enemies often told, because it was easier to fear monsters than to understand men. The real Vikings were adaptable, practical, ruthless when necessary, patient when rewarded, and intelligent enough to learn from every shore they touched. They were traders as well as raiders, settlers as well as killers, navigators, negotiators, mercenaries, kings. When walls stopped them from taking wealth quickly, they began to ask a new question. If a city could not be burned from the outside, could it be broken another way? The answer was not always the same. Sometimes they threatened. Sometimes they negotiated. Sometimes they demanded tribute in exchange for leaving. Sometimes they camped nearby and waited for hunger to do what axes could not. And sometimes, they attacked with everything they had. Imagine a fortified town at dawn. Behind the wall, the defenders have been awake for hours. They have heard the sounds all night. Axes striking wood beyond the ditch. Men shouting in a language many of them do not understand. The groan of shields being lifted. The scraping of ladders dragged over frozen ground. Inside, there are priests, merchants, families, soldiers, children trying not to cry. The people have heard stories of the Northmen. Some stories are true. Some have grown in the telling. But fear does not separate fact from rumor. Fear uses both. On the wall, a man tightens his grip around a spear. Below, the Vikings are forming. Round shields overlap. Helmets catch pale light. Beards are wet with mist. Their ships wait behind them, pulled up near the riverbank like dark animals resting after a hunt. For the defenders, the wall is safety. For the attackers, the wall is insult. It says, your speed ends here. It says, your fire is not enough. It says, climb, or go home. And then the first ladder rises. There is a particular kind of terror in the beginning of an assault. Before the clash, there is still imagination. Every man can picture his own death in 100 different ways. An arrow through the throat. A stone crushing the skull. A fall into the ditch. A blade waiting at the top of the ladder. But once the attack begins, imagination disappears. There is only the next step. The next breath. The shield above the head. The weight of the man behind you pushing forward. The wall does not need to defeat everyone. It only needs to make the first men die badly enough that the men behind them hesitate. That hesitation is where a siege is often won. The Vikings knew how to break a line of men. But a wall was not a line. A line could bend. A line could lose courage. A line could be outflanked. A wall had no flank unless someone found a gate, a weak point, a traitor, or a way around. The defenders hurled stones. They thrust spears down into faces. They poured whatever they could onto the men below. They shot arrows into the crowded mass where shields could not cover every angle. And when a Viking reached the top, he did not find victory. He found a narrow killing place. A place where one man climbing upward had to fight men standing firm. A place where the legend of the raider became the body of a soldier, exposed, sweating, and mortal. This was the lesson walls taught. They did not make defenders invincible. But they made attackers pay in time, blood, and order. They turned courage into a resource that could be spent. And even Viking courage was not endless. Yet the Northmen kept coming. Because the cities behind those walls held what the raiding world desired most. Silver. Food. Hostages. Weapons. Prestige. And more than that, legitimacy. To plunder a monastery was profitable. To force a king to pay tribute was powerful. But to take or threaten a fortified city was something larger. It meant the Viking war bands were no longer just storms on the coast. They were becoming forces that could challenge states, negotiate with rulers, and shape the political map of Europe. The walls were meant to stop them. Instead, in some places, the walls forced them to evolve. The great heathen army that landed in England in the 9th century was not a simple raiding party. It was a moving military force with ambitions beyond quick plunder. It occupied, fought, wintered, bargained, and took territory. It understood that wealth was not only carried away in ships. Sometimes wealth was found in land, taxation, control, and the submission of towns. Against such ambitions, walls became both obstacle and prize. A fortified settlement could delay the Vikings. But if taken, it could also shelter them. The same defenses that protected a kingdom could be turned against it. This was one of the great ironies of medieval war. A wall belonged to whoever could hold it. In England, Alfred the Great understood the danger more clearly than most. He did not defeat the Vikings by chasing every raiding party into the marshes or trying to predict every landing. He built a system. Fortified burhs, roads, local defense, organized response. Places strong enough to resist sudden attack and close enough to support one another. It was not glorious in the way a saga is glorious. It was not a single heroic charge. It was administration. Planning. Labor. Stone, timber, duty, and discipline. But it worked because it attacked the heart of the Viking advantage. It made surprise less decisive. It made speed less final. It forced raiders to confront prepared places instead of isolated victims. And when the Vikings reached those prepared walls, the old question returned. How do you burn what will not burn? The answer, increasingly, was that you do not merely burn it. You surround it. You bargain with it. You cut it off. You exploit weakness. You wait for hunger, politics, betrayal, or fear. This was a different kind of strength. Not the flash of an axe in torchlight. Not the roar of men storming from ships. But the slow pressure of a hand closing around a throat. Siege warfare is often remembered through great machines, towers, rams, and catapults. But in the early medieval world, many sieges were less spectacular and more brutal in their simplicity. An army could sit outside a town and make life inside smaller every day. No fields harvested. No trade entering. No messages leaving without risk. No confidence that help would come. Inside the walls, the defenders watched their food stores fall. They watched sickness move through crowded streets. They listened to arguments among leaders. They wondered whether surrender meant survival, slavery, ransom, or massacre. Outside, the attackers watched too. They watched for smoke, for weakness, for fewer men on the battlements, for a gate opened at the wrong hour, for a desperate messenger slipping into the dark. A siege was a contest of nerves. And the Vikings, who had once used fear as a sudden weapon, learned to use fear as a long one. But walls also changed the Vikings themselves. A raider can live by momentum. A besieger must live by organization. He must feed men who are not moving. He must guard camps. He must maintain discipline among warriors who expected reward. He must prevent desertion, boredom, disease, and rivalries from tearing the army apart. He must decide when to attack, when to wait, when to negotiate, and when to leave before victory becomes ruin. These were not small matters. They were the difference between a war band and an army. Between a raid and a campaign. Between terror and strategy. Some Viking leaders understood this better than others. The most successful were not simply the fiercest men in the shield wall. They were the men who could keep violence useful. Men who knew when a city was worth the cost. Men who could turn thread into silver without wasting lives. Men who could abandon pride when the wall was too strong and return later when politics had weakened it. In this sense, the wall was not only a defensive structure. It was a test of leadership. Many men could burn a village. Fewer could break a city. And fewer still could decide not to break it, because tribute, alliance, or settlement offered more than smoke. By the time Viking forces appeared before the great cities of the Frankish world, the pattern had grown even more complex. Rivers carried the longships deep inland. The Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, and countless smaller waterways became roads of invasion. The Vikings could appear where inland populations once believed the sea could not reach them. Towns that had never imagined dragon-prowed ships near their walls suddenly heard the same sound that coastal people had feared for generations: oars, voices, iron, and the creaking of ships against the bank. Paris became one of the most famous symbols of this struggle. A city surrounded by water, protected by walls, bridges, towers, and defenders who understood that if the Northmen passed, the interior of the kingdom lay open. The Vikings were not merely raiding a village now. They were testing the nerve of a civilization. The siege was not simple. It was not a tale of wild men screaming until stone surrendered. It was endurance. Engineering. Assault. Disease. Negotiation. Political calculation. The defenders used the city's fortifications to deny the Vikings easy passage. The Vikings attacked, adapted, and pressed. They understood that forcing a city to submit could be as valuable as taking it outright. Kings and counts understood that paying the Vikings might save one place while condemning another. Walls did not end Viking violence. They redirected it. They made violence political. They turned the question from, "Can they burn us?" into, "What must we give them to leave?" That question haunted Europe. Tribute could buy time. But tribute could also invite return. A wall could protect a city. But a wall could also trap fear inside. And the Vikings learned that sometimes the most powerful thing outside a fortress was not the axe. It was the knowledge that the people inside were counting their food. There is a temptation to imagine history as a contest between offense and defense, as if one side invents a weapon and the other invents a shield. But the truth is more human. Each side is watching the other. Each side is learning. The raider learns the wall. The builder learns the raid. The king learns the river. The war leader learns the price of delay. The Vikings forced Europe to fortify. Europe's fortifications forced the Vikings to become more than raiders. And in that pressure, both changed. The image of the Viking as a man of pure destruction is incomplete. Destruction was part of the story, but it was not the whole. When they reached walls they could not burn, they did not simply vanish. They became settlers in some places, rulers in others, mercenaries in distant empires, traders across vast routes, and political actors in kingdoms that once knew them only as terror from the sea. A wall can stop a raid. But it can also begin a transformation. Because when a warrior cannot take what he wants by the old method, he must either fail or become something else. This is why the moment matters. Not because one wall defeated all Vikings. Not because stone suddenly made Europe safe. It did not. The raids continued. The wars continued. Cities fell, tribute was paid, kingdoms trembled, and the longships kept moving through the rivers like blades through dark cloth. But the encounter with serious fortifications marked a limit. It showed that terror alone had boundaries. It showed that the fastest warriors in Europe could be slowed. It showed that fire, the great equalizer of wooden worlds, lost much of its power against stone, earthworks, organized defense, and patient resistance. And once a limit is discovered, war changes. The Vikings had to think beyond the burning roof. Their enemies had to think beyond the desperate prayer. Both entered a harsher, more strategic age. In that age, the battlefield was no longer only the beach, the monastery yard, or the village road. It was the supply line. The bridge. The fortified gate. The winter camp. The treaty table. The hunger inside a city. The morale outside it. The loyalty of local nobles. The decision of a king who had to choose between fighting, paying, or watching his lands burn. Walls made war slower. But they also made it deeper. They pulled violence into the structures of power. And the Vikings, for all their ferocity, understood power. They had always understood that a reputation could be sharpened like a sword. That fear could open doors before axes touched them. That wealth could be taken not only by killing, but by making others believe killing was about to begin. Before wooden villages, this reputation was enough. Before stone walls, it had to be proven again. And again. There must have been moments when the old warriors felt the difference. A man who had once leapt from a ship and watched an entire settlement collapse into panic now stood before a wall that gave him nothing. No fear in its face. No weakness in its eyes. No answer to his shouting. Only height. Only silence. Only defenders waiting above. Perhaps he cursed it. Perhaps he respected it. Perhaps, in some private part of himself, he understood that this was the future coming toward him, as surely as his own ship had once come toward trembling shores. The age of easy burning was ending. Not everywhere. Not all at once. But enough. And from that change came a different Europe. A Europe of fortified towns, organized defenses, stronger kingship, negotiated tribute, military adaptation, and Viking powers that no longer lived only at the edge of the map. The Northmen did not disappear when the walls rose higher. They crossed them when they could. They starved them when they had to. They settled behind them when fortune allowed. And sometimes, they became the men defending the walls against others. That is the strange rhythm of history. The attacker becomes the ruler. The raider becomes the tax collector. The foreign terror becomes part of the land. The ship on the river becomes a memory carved into the politics of kingdoms. But the wall remains one of the clearest symbols of that turning point. It is the place where speed met patience, where flame met stone, where legend met logistics, where the Viking world, so often imagined in the instant of the raid, was forced into the longer, heavier reality of conquest. And conquest is not the same as plunder. Plunder can be carried away. Conquest must be held. Plunder needs courage for a day. Conquest demands discipline for years. The walls the Vikings could not burn taught them that difference. They taught Europe that defense was not only a local matter, but a system of survival. They taught kings that roads, garrisons, bridges, and fortified settlements could do what scattered bravery could not. They taught raiders that the richest prizes would not always collapse beneath the first torch. And they taught everyone that war was becoming more organized, more political, and more permanent. In the end, the most important battle was not always the one fought at the gate. It was the battle between ways of thinking. One side believed in speed. The other began to believe in preparation. One side trusted shock. The other trusted structure. One side arrived with fire. The other answered with stone. And between them, medieval Europe was remade. So when the Vikings reached walls they could not burn, they were not simply stopped by masonry. They were stopped by a new reality. A reality that said the world had learned from them. A reality that said fear could build as well as destroy. A reality that said the next age of war would belong not only to the men who struck first, but to the men who endured. The longships still waited on the river. The axes were still sharp. The warriors were still dangerous. But above them, the walls stood in the pale light, scarred by smoke, darkened by rain, crowded with defenders who knew that survival had become a matter of height, stone, discipline, and time. And somewhere below, a Viking looked up. For the first time, perhaps, he understood that not every world could be taken in a day. Some worlds had to be surrounded. Some had to be starved. Some had to be negotiated with. Some had to be conquered slowly. And some, no matter how much fire a man carried in his hands, would not burn.